The concept of a system for filing and for the cross-referencing of specimen collection and identification information was first advanced by A.D. Hopkins in 1894. The system was formally initiated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1902 by Hopkins himself, who was subsequently named Chief of Forest Insect Investigations. It was still in use in 1987 by more than 20 Forest Service units of forest insect and disease research and forest pest management, and by the Agricultural Research Service Systematic Entomology Laboratory, ARS-SEL. A salient feature of the system was the controlled assignment of Hopkins numbers to avoid redundancy within or between field units. These unique numbers allow for the keying of records, an essential prerequisite for the creation of a proper relational database. The paper records of the Hopkins Notes and Records system and the corresponding digital records in the Hopkins U.S. System Index (HUSSI) are codependent repositories for data about specimens of forest insects and their damage. These specimens were curated by government professionals beginning with Hopkins's work at the USDA. The more than 80 years of records with identification and collection information are from all geographic areas managed by the USDA Forest Service, as well as small subset of records from other countries. Genesis. A.D. Hopkins, commonly referred to as the father of forest entomology in the United States, formulated the record-keeping system that now bears his name. Hopkins brought his system to the federal government when he came to work for the Division of Entomology in the late 1890s, by which time he had already been using his record-keeping system at West Virginia University, Morgantown, West Virginia, where he previously worked. Hopkins then brought the system to the USDA Division of Entomology in 1902. It was subsequently adopted by personnel of forest insect investigations at field stations throughout the country. The system contains U.S. in its name to distinguish it from those earlier Hopkins records at West Virginia University. The Hopkins U.S. system became widely used by Forest Service research, by other pest management units, and also by ARS-SEL. It was in continuous use until the mid-1980s. The Hopkins Notebook series. The biological data from the original Hopkins records were recorded on either 3x5 forms, or on 3x5 or 5x8 cards, hereafter referred to simply as cards, that were filed in the Hopkins Notebook series. These notebooks are the original database from which the Hopkins U.S. system developed. The system, represented in these volumes, consists of notebook entries bearing checklist numbers, and a set of such file cards. Cards are indexed to the descriptive narratives and notes that appear in the notebooks in numerical order by checklist number. Additional notes often provide extensive textual descriptions of the writer's observations, and many include detailed drawings as well. The table of contents for a given notebook was derived from the way in which those checklist numbers were assigned to individual collectors. Taken as a whole, the Notebook series chronicles the work and travels of many of the pioneering figures of North American entomology, from the turn of the century to about 1920. Beginning in 1899, number series, usually in blocks of 100 to 200, appear to have been assigned to entomologists as needed. There are also blocks of numbers that were evidently set aside to accommodate material that was sent to the staff entomologists for identification. Such blocks of numbers are designated office notes. Some blocks of numbers in the Office Notes series are from outside the contiguous United States. For example, specimens are collections from Central and South America, Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Africa appear there. The information shown in the office notes often include references to the original correspondence accompanying the specimens when they were submitted. The Hopkins record cards. The card observations consist of the collection and identification information associated by number with specific insect of damaged specimens. The numbers also correspond to identical numbers originally attached to mounted insects in collections distributed across the country. They connect the field sample to the information about how, when, and by whom the work was done. All of that information is detailed by the Hopkins record cards. The cards are the only link that exists between the sample and its physical provenance. At some archive locations, the early records included the above-mentioned notebooks or ledgers containing more detailed information. The card files usually have three components. A numerical file, the basic file of cards in numerical order, the species file or insect species index, and host file or host index. The system has been applied differently at the various field locations. Some units have only the numerical file. Organizational framework. Hopkins's organizing scheme was based on a series of duplicate paper records that contained collection and identification information about the specimens. Each record was given a unique sequential Hopkins U.S. number. Specimens, each one bearing its own unique Hopkins U.S. number, and collection records were stored at Forest Service research stations and laboratories, regional offices, and at the ARS-SEL in the U.S. National Museum, Smithsonian Institution. The Hopkins U.S. system contained about 163,000 paper records representing several hundred thousand identified specimens, a series of specimens. These are either of insects or samples of insect damage. Each record has information about taxon, insect and plant association, collection location, date, and collector at a minimum. In addition to the drawings and textual narratives, the record can also have measurements, notes on the research study, a spray program, or rearing and other biological data provided by the original collector. Specimen collection, preparation and record keeping. All the details of the overall process can be found in R. G. Mitchell's unpublished monograph. That work includes the procedures one follows from the time insect material is collected until identifications are obtained. A numbered list of those procedures, taken from the monograph, is reproduced below, with a block diagram of the corresponding workflow shown on the right. Collect insects or infested material. Keeping insects separated by host. Rear insects from infested host material or, in the case of defoliators, on fresh host material. When insects are collected as adults, rearing may not be necessary. At times, mating of insects and egg-laying may be desired to obtain needed biological information. If the rearing or collecting results are of interest, assign a Hopkins number to the collection. A single Hopkins number cannot be assigned to insects collected from more than one host species, or to insects of the same host species when the collections are separated appreciably by time, space, or host condition. Fill out general note card. Figure 1. In the number file after preparing and editing a rough draft, the information should be typed on the card stamped with the Hopkins number. If the insects were reared, fill out rearing note summary card. Fill out, if needed, species note card. Separate insects by order and family. By microscopic examination, decide how many species are represented. Assign a letter suffix to the Hopkins number for each tentative identification and fill out species summary card. Label insects, including a suffixed Hopkins number label, and place specimens in a Schmidt box in order of Hopkins number. Later, The insects to be identified will be removed and sent to a specialist. The duplicates retained at the station are labeled with a blue tag to show that specimens have been sent away. Make out 3 copies of the species determination card for each insect species being sent away for identification. Write a covering memo for the insects to be shipped. 1 white copy is prepared for the division chief in Washington, D.C. In addition to the copy for the station files, type 6 copies of the insect identification slip. Attach 2 copies of each species determination card. Step number 9. And 3 copies of the insect identification slip. Step number 12. To the covering memo going to the specialist, usually through a ARS Division of Identification and Parasite Introduction. Mail memo. Attach 1 insect identification slip. Step number 11. To the covering memo going to the W.O. This goes with other mail to the chief. U.S.F.S. Attach 1 insect identification slip. Step number 11. To the file copy of the covering memo and place in the pending file. U.S.F.S. file code number 4500-4. Place 1 insect identification slip. Step number 11. In the shipping box and mail specimens to the specialist for identification. Clip. Use paper clip all file copies of species determination cards together and place in pending section at the back of the number file. Place the other cards in the proper place in the number file. Current status. In 1986, concern for the safety and integrity of the Hopkins U.S. system files prompted what was then the Forest Insect and Disease Research Staff, FIDRWO, to take steps to preserve the information contained in the Hopkins U.S. system. The intent was also to consolidate the information and make it more useful and accessible to the scientific community. About 153,000 Hopkins U.S. system cards and nearly 10,000 notebook pages throughout the Forest Service and at ARS-SEL were microfilmed. Microfiche sets of the file cards were distributed to the Office of FIDRWO, Forest Service labs, regional offices, and field units nationwide, and to ARS-SEL, to make the information in the Hopkins files more accessible. In 1987, FIDRWO began building the digital database that would become HUSSI. Approximately 61,000 ASCII records were initially created. Of these, about 37,000 records from Hopkins system files held by Forest Service units, mostly in the West, were developed into a relational database. The additional 20,000 plus digitized ASCII records are from the Hopkins system paper records held by ARS-SEL at the U.S. National Museum. These have yet to be included in the database. Future of the digital records. The existing HUSSI database can be queried to produce plant host and insect host lists, historical records, and, for example, information on historic and recent geographic range of forest insects to indicate climate change. The unique Hopkins U.S. number allows users to obtain desired supplemental information on the physical location of curated specimens, and additional information on the original paper Hopkins record. Such information is available from Forest Service repositories, ARS-SEL at the U.S. National Museum, Smithsonian Institution, and from several universities where specimens, records, and/or microfiche now reside. The goal is to make the records available over the Forest Service's internal network, and over the Internet as well. The Hopkins U.S. system is of great potential for use in forestry and forest entomology from a global perspective. The notes and records accumulated in the system constitutes the foundational work for forest entomology in North America and elsewhere. They represent an invaluable set of historical field observations. The system was also a means of information sharing for the very earliest investigators during the pioneering phases of forest entomology in the United States. At that time, little was known, not even the identities, of a large proportion of forest insects in this country. With its files containing nearly 200,000 records, the system is most important as a repository for information on the biologies, habits, and distributions of many thousands of insects of forest trees and other woody plants. Moreover, the observations in the notes have formed an important basis for the study of most of our major forest insect pests. They continued until recent times to provide information for field manuals, host lists, and biological studies. As forest conditions and forest management practices change, the roster of insects perceived to be pests changes. The Hopkins U.S. system files contain valuable biological information that can be used basis for dealing with insects reaching pest status. Because the files contain a vast amount of information on relationships between forest pests and their parasites, predators, and other associated insects, they have served as a source of information to evaluate the potential for biological control through introductions, redistributions of natural enemies and manipulation of habitats.